The dead woman should not have been there. For nearly 4,000 years, she lay beneath the salt and sand of one of the most hostile deserts on Earth. Yet when archaeologists uncovered her body near the vanished waters of Lop Nur, her face was still recognizable. Her skin remained stretched across her cheekbones. Strands of brown hair framed her head. Even her eyelashes had survived. But preservation was not the real mystery. She had been buried deep inside Western China during the Bronze Age, and yet, to many early researchers, her appearance seemed to point somewhere far beyond the mountains. Her narrow face, her prominent nose, her brown, almost reddish hair. Even the carefully woven clothing found among the desert burials appeared strangely familiar. The conclusion seemed obvious. She, or her ancestors, must have come from the West. For decades, researchers searched for the migration that could explain her presence. They traced ancient steppe cultures. They studied forgotten mountain routes. They compared textiles, languages, crops, and burial traditions. Almost every major theory began with the same assumption. These mysterious people had come from somewhere else. Then, ancient DNA revealed something no major theory had predicted. The woman became known as the Beauty of Lulan. She was discovered in 1980 near the eastern edge of the Tarim Basin, an enormous depression enclosed by some of the highest mountain systems on Earth. At its center lies the Taklamakan Desert. Today, the name evokes endless dunes, abandoned settlements, and landscapes so dry that rivers can vanish into the sand. But thousands of years ago, communities survived along shifting waterways and fragile oases at the desert's margins. Life here was difficult, yet the same environment that threatened the living created extraordinary conditions for preserving the dead. Bodies buried in the dry, salt-rich ground lost moisture before decay could destroy them. Skin survived, hair remained attached, clothing retained its shape. These people had not been embalmed like Egyptian mummies. The desert had preserved them naturally. And as more graves emerged from beneath the sand, the mystery became much larger. Because the Beauty of Lulan was not an isolated traveler, she appeared to belong to an entire forgotten population. At Xiaohe Cemetery, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of burials in a remote landscape surrounded by desert. Above the graves stood tall wooden markers. Below them were boat-shaped coffins covered with animal hides. The dead wore wool cloaks, felt hats, and fur-lined boots. Some were buried with woven baskets, others with sprigs of ephedra. Objects connected to herding, food, ritual, and daily life accompanied them into the grave. Nothing suggested a group merely passing through. The scale of the cemetery pointed to an established community. Generation after generation had returned to the same burial ground. They followed elaborate traditions. They invested enormous effort in honoring their dead. They belonged to this landscape, yet their appearance seemed to suggest the opposite. Some had reddish, brown, or light-colored hair. Many possessed facial characteristics that researchers associated with populations farther west. Their wool textiles invited comparisons with weaving traditions found thousands of kilometers away. And these people had lived centuries before the Silk Road became the famous network linking China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. If they had come from the west, how had they reached the Tarim Basin? Which mountains had they crossed? Which ancient population had they belonged to? One possibility led north. During the Bronze Age, pastoral communities associated with the Afanasyevo culture occupied regions around the Altai Mountains. Their ancestry was connected to populations much farther west on the Eurasian steppe. Researchers already knew that movement across the steppe had carried people, animals, technologies, and languages across enormous distances. Perhaps a branch of these herders had traveled south. Perhaps they had crossed the mountains and entered the Tarim Basin. The theory appeared capable of explaining more than physical appearance. Centuries later, people in the region wrote languages known as Tocharian. Their existence presented another mystery. Tocharian belonged to the Indo-European language family, yet it appeared thousands of kilometers east of most other ancient Indo-European languages. Could the ancestors of the desert mummies have carried an early form of that language into the basin? Could the faces preserved beneath the sand belong to the descendants of an ancient migration from the western steppe? It was a compelling explanation, but it was not the only one. Southwest of the Tarim Basin, sophisticated oasis communities flourished across parts of Central Asia. Known collectively as the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, these societies practiced agriculture, produced elaborate crafts, and participated in long-distance exchange. Perhaps migrants from these oasis settlements had entered the basin. Perhaps they had carried farming traditions and their ancestry with them. A third possibility focused not on a single civilization, but on a route. Mountain valleys and highland pastures formed what researchers call the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor. Through these connected landscapes, people could travel between regions that appeared isolated on a map. Perhaps the ancestors of the Tarim communities had moved through these mountain passages, bringing crops, livestock, textiles, and unfamiliar burial traditions. The proposed origins were different, but every explanation shared the same assumption. The earliest Tarim people were outsiders. Their bodies appeared to be evidence of migration. Then, archaeologists began examining what these communities ate. Inside vessels associated with the burials, researchers found evidence of dairy foods. The wheat they used had deeper origins in Western Eurasia. Their millet traced its history toward Eastern Asia. Their wool connected them to pastoral technologies extending across distant regions. Even the ephedra placed in some graves invited comparison with traditions found elsewhere in Central Asia. The Tarim Basin did not appear isolated. It looked like a meeting place. Foods, materials, technologies, and customs had crossed enormous distances before reaching these desert communities, and at first that seemed to strengthen the migration theories. If so many things had arrived from outside, and perhaps people had arrived with them. But there was a problem. Archaeology could reveal connections. It could not prove ancestry. Objects can move without populations. A crop can pass from one village to another. Seeds can travel farther than the people who first cultivated them. A weaving method can be observed, copied, and adapted. Animals can be exchanged. A ritual plant can move through networks connecting communities that never meet directly. The presence of foreign ideas did not prove the arrival of foreign settlers. To discover where the Tarim people came from, researchers needed evidence carried not in their clothing, but inside their bodies. For years, genetic studies produced an uncertain picture. Some findings appeared to support Western connections. Others indicated ancestry related to populations in Eastern or Southern Asia. Different samples and different methods generated competing interpretations, and the debate became entangled with modern questions of identity and political claims. Ancient remains were being asked to answer questions their original communities could never have imagined. Access became increasingly restricted, and the mystery remained unresolved. But genetic technology was advancing. Earlier studies often examined only limited genetic markers. Researchers could now recover information from across an ancient individual's genome. For the first time, the major migration theories could be tested directly. If the Tarim population descended from recent steppe migrants, that movement should have left an identifiable genetic signature. Descendants of the Afanasyevo should have shared substantial ancestry with Afanasyevo populations. Migrants from Central Asian oasis societies should have left a different, but still detectable, pattern. The dead themselves could finally reveal which theory was correct. In 2021, researchers published genome-wide data from ancient individuals in the Tarim Basin and the neighboring Dzungarian Basin. The comparison immediately revealed an important difference. The people north of the Tarim Basin showed evidence of outside connections and genetic mixing. Their genomes recorded movement between populations, but the earliest sampled people from the Tarim Basin did not. Researchers found no detectable Western steppe ancestry in these individuals. The expected Afanasyevo genetic signature was absent. The people whose appearance had inspired decades of theories about Western migration were not genetically consistent with recent settlers from the Western steppe. The major explanations had failed, but removing those theories created a much older mystery. If these people were not recent arrivals, who were they? The answer led thousands of years deeper into the past, long before the Bronze Age, long before farming, back to Ice Age Siberia. In 1928, archaeologists excavating near the village of Malta in Siberia discovered the grave of a young child. The child had been buried roughly 24,000 years ago. Decades later, DNA recovered from those remains helped reveal the existence of an ancient population now known as the ancient North Eurasians. They had once occupied parts of northern Eurasia, but over thousands of years they largely disappeared as a distinct population. Their genetic legacy survived because their descendants contributed ancestry to many later groups. Traces spread into populations in Europe. Other branches contributed ancestry to indigenous peoples of the Americas. But in most places, this ancestry became mixed with that of other populations. The earliest sampled Tarim people were different. Their genomes preserved this ancient ancestry to an extraordinary degree. Genetic modeling suggested that roughly 72% of their ancestry came from a population related to the ancient North Eurasians. Most of the remainder was associated with an ancient Northeast Asian lineage. The people buried at Xiaohe were not descendants of a recently arrived Western civilization. They appeared to descend largely from a deeply rooted Inner Asian population, one that had survived long after similar ancestry had become mixed elsewhere across Eurasia. The desert had preserved more than their bodies. It had preserved evidence of a human lineage whose distinct genetic profile had nearly vanished from the rest of the continent. But this discovery created an even stranger contradiction. The Tarim communities appeared genetically isolated. Their culture was not. Their wheat had distant Western origins. Their millet connected them to developments in the East. Their use of dairy reflected pastoral knowledge shared across Eurasia. Their wool clothing drew on technologies that had traveled between communities for generations. Ideas had crossed the mountains. Foods had crossed the mountains. Materials and technologies had crossed the mountains. Yet according to the earliest genomes examined, large numbers of outsiders had not become part of the population. The Tarim people had participated in exchange while maintaining remarkable genetic continuity. They were not a forgotten colony at the end of a migration. They resembled a genetic island inside a continent becoming increasingly connected through movement, and that raised another question. How could a population adopt influences from so many directions while remaining genetically distinct? The answer may lie in the way culture moves. A crop did not need to complete its entire journey with the people who first cultivated it. Seeds could pass through dozens of communities. Each group could grow them, exchange them, and carry them farther. The same was true of technology. A community could learn to process milk without being replaced by foreign herders. People could adopt new weaving techniques without sharing the ancestry of the communities where those methods began. Ideas could spread through trade, through observation, through neighboring settlements, perhaps through limited intermarriage that left little genetic impact on the individuals sampled so far. Culture could travel farther than genes, and that possibility changed the meaning of the mummies. Their clothing was not a map of biological ancestry. Their burial traditions were not proof of a foreign homeland, and their appearance was not evidence of a recent migration. The features once interpreted as Western may instead have reflected variation within an ancient population whose ancestry reached deep into Ice Age Eurasia. But the DNA did not solve every mystery. The genomes came from a limited number of individuals and archaeological settings. The Tarim Basin is enormous. Communities living in different places or during different periods may have had very different histories. Future discoveries could reveal ancestry not visible in the earliest group. Their language also remains unknown. The later Tocharian languages are documented roughly a millennium after some of the famous Tarim mummies lived. The geographic connection is intriguing, but geography alone cannot prove linguistic descent. DNA cannot recover the words people spoke beside the graves at Xiaohe, nor can it explain exactly how the community maintained its genetic isolation. Were marriages governed by strict social traditions? Did geography separate them from neighboring populations even while trade continued? Did only small numbers of outsiders enter the community? Or does Xiaohe represent a particular group whose history differed from other populations still hidden beneath the desert? And there is another mystery. What happened to them? Later populations in the region show increasing evidence of migration and genetic mixing. Over centuries, the Tarim Basin became part of expanding networks connecting Eastern Asia, the Eurasian steppe, Central Asia, and civilizations far beyond. The genetic isolation visible at Xiaohe did not last forever, but its existence changes how the earlier period must be understood. When the beauty of Lulan first emerged from the desert, her face seemed to demand a journey. Researchers looked west. They searched for the route her ancestors must have taken. They examined steppe migrations, oasis civilizations, mountain corridors, the movement of Indo-European languages. But the genome suggested that the journey they were searching for may never have happened. The real movement had been hidden in the objects surrounding the dead. Wheat traveled, millet traveled, dairy traditions traveled, wool technologies traveled, ideas traveled. Beliefs and burial customs changed as communities encountered knowledge from beyond their own landscape. Yet the people themselves could remain deeply connected to an ancestry rooted in the region's distant past. The discovery did not reveal a lost European colony in ancient China. It revealed something far more unexpected. The descendants of an ancient Eurasian population had survived in relative genetic isolation, while participating in a world of expanding cultural exchange, and that may be the larger lesson buried beneath the Taklamakan. Human history is not always a sequence in which one population arrives and replaces another. Sometimes knowledge crosses a frontier without armies or mass migrations. Sometimes communities adopt foreign technologies without losing their ancestry. And sometimes a face preserved in the desert appears to point toward a distant homeland, only because we assume appearance, culture, language, and genes must all tell the same story. The Tarim mummies show that they do not. For thousands of years, the desert concealed their bodies. For decades, their bodies concealed their origins. And when DNA finally revealed their ancestry, the greatest surprise was not where these people had come from. It was how long they may already have been there.